big spending and big taxes and still be for the little guy. And, Mr. President, we have on the other side of the aisle people who are for big government, big spending, big taxes. They're not for the little guy. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have been listening to the remarks of my friend from Wyoming, and I noticed that he repeatedly indicated that what we needed to do here in this building was to keep the military funded, to deal with the deficit, and to cut spending. And it is my firm belief that if we were sent a bill that kept the military funded, that dealt with the deficit, and that cut spending, it would pass in the Senate very readily. Indeed, we've already agreed to $73 billion in spending cuts. As Senator McCaskill said earlier, the problem is that the Republicans won't take yes for an answer. The issue that is dividing us at this point is not the need to keep the military funded. We completely agree on that. It is not the need to deal with the deficit. We completely agree on that. Indeed, the last time we successfully dealt with the deficit, it was under Democrats. And clearly, we have gone way more than halfway by agreeing to cut $73 billion in spending. So as to those 3 points, I think the answers are yes, yes, and yes. So what is the problem? The problem is two riders that are being insisted on in the negotiations, one of which would eliminate funding for Planned Parenthood, and the second of which would gut the Clean Air Act. Planned Parenthood and the Clean Air Act. Now, I thought this was about the deficit. I thought this was about solving our fiscal situation. The facts are a little different. Here we are, mere hours away from the first government shutdown since Newt Gingrich forced one during President Clinton's first term. We are facing some 800,000 federal workers being furloughed, millions more, including men and women in uniform, who will begin working without pay. Projects will grind to a halt. People working under government contracts will stop. And there will be a real danger to our fragile economic recovery that is just starting to gain steam. Why take that risk? Well, in front of cameras all week, Republicans have been saying that despite these dangers, they will threaten a government shutdown because we need to tackle the deficit. The story behind the scenes is quite different. Even though the Tea Party has focused 100% of its cost-cutting fury on only 12% of federal spending, only the non-security so-called discretionary spending, we agreed to a level of cuts that the Republicans wanted. Nothing on the revenue side, everything on the spending side, and only from 12% of the budget, yet we were still able to come far more than halfway to where the Republicans are, virtually within single-digit billions of dollars of agreement. Yet we still find ourselves without funding for the government beyond tomorrow night. We've heard today that it has to do with the fact that we didn't pass a budget last year. Well, we didn't pass a budget last year, but we tried. As Senator McCaskill pointed out, she and I were here on the floor when the omnibus spending bill came to the floor. It had been negotiated in a bipartisan fashion. It had come through all of the different appropriating committees. It would have funded the government through September 30th. We thought we had an agreement, and at the last minute, all of the Republicans who had agreed to it changed their minds, literally while we were on the floor. The bill went down. One Republican senator even took to the floor to gloat about the end of that bill. So it's a little bit of crocodile tears to blame the Democrats for not having an appropriations and budget bill at this point from the side of the chamber here that took that bill down, that pulled their individuals who had participated in that bipartisan bill out of the deal, that filibustered it, and that shut it down. That's why we're here today. The minority party used its filibuster power, walked away from a deal that it already signed off on, and took down the spending bill. So here we are. It's important to stay somewhat close to the facts. So now the Republicans are using the deficit concerns, which I think Senator Barrasso said very clearly. Keep the military funded, deal with the deficit, and cut spending. That's what we're prepared to agree to do. But the bill that we're being asked to agree to right now is a Trojan horse. It is a Trojan horse that looks like a deficit bill, but inside it is filled with Tea Party ideology. It is filled with an extremist, right-wing political agenda to do things like eliminate Planned Parenthood and give America's polluters free rein in violation of the Clean Air Act as it has been determined by the United States Supreme Court to apply. This is no longer about the deficit. This is about trying to force a very radical agenda down America's throats in a Trojan horse that looks like it's about the deficit. What's it really about? Well, you don't have to go very far from this building. Just a few days ago, outside, you had the Tea Party ralliers. And what were they chanting outside of the Capitol? They were chanting, "Shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down." That is what the Tea Party wants. That is why we are here. And sure enough, when the Speaker went to his caucus on the Republican side and announced to them, to the people who are actually here making decisions in this Congress, that he was notifying the administrative staff on the House side to prepare for a shutdown, what was the reaction? It was a standing ovation supporting the Speaker in that. So on the outside of the building, you have the Tea Partiers chanting, "Shut it down, shut it down, shut it down." You have the extreme members of the House Republican caucus out there with the Tea Partiers, egging them on, "Shut it down, shut it down, shut it down." They come back into the building. The Speaker says, "We've got to get ready to shut it down." They give him a standing ovation. They could not be happier about this. They load the bill up with things that have nothing to do with funding the military, nothing to do with cutting the deficit, nothing to do with bringing down spending, but instead accomplish ideological missions that the Republican Party has been on for years.
Question?
Absolutely. I yield for a question.
Well, first, I thank him for his outstanding remarks. My question is this. Isn't it true that we've had many, many Republicans in the House, Sarah Palin and some of Newt Gingrich, presidential candidates, erstwhile potential presidential candidates, as well as some of our colleagues here, Republican, saying they want to shut down the government? And at least my question to the gentleman is, I can't recall a single Democratic elected official saying they want to shut the government down. And my second question is, doesn't that show something about who is itching for a shutdown, or at least thinks they can use the shutdown to accomplish an agenda?
I agree with the senator from New York. I cannot recall a single senator expressing any desire for a shutdown. I've been present in our caucus meetings. Not one person has once said that there is anything good about a shutdown. We are all gravely concerned about what a shutdown would do to our fragile economic recovery. This is still about jobs. Ultimately, we still have to grow an economy in this country. And when we shut down every government contract and put those people out of work, when we shut down every government project and put those people out of work, when we take paychecks away from government workers, and when we furlough government workers, what does that do to the economy? Any economist will tell you it strikes at a terrible blow, and we recognize that. And that is why no elected Democratic official has said one good word about a shutdown, and that is very different from what we're seeing from the other side, where standing ovations, where chanting mobs egged on by sitting members of Congress, where public statements by candidates for president and by members of Congress have all said that the
Senator's time has expired.
Thank my colleague.
My time has expired. I thank the senator from New York for his question. I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I thank the chair and would share a few things. If my Democratic colleagues would prefer not to shut the government down, then don't do it. The House, the Republican House, has passed a bill to fund the government, to fund the Defense Department, and the Senate, the Democratic Senate, has passed nothing. Indeed, the Democratic leadership proposed a bill that they said was worthwhile that would have reduced spending by $4.6 billion. 10 Democratic senators defected from the leadership position. Pretty gutsy thing to do on an issue as important as this.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I'll be glad to yield for a question, although my time is limited on this.
Well, I thank the senator for his courtesy in yielding for the question.
All right, go ahead.
If, in fact, this is really about the deficit, and if, in fact, it is really about reducing spending, and if, in fact, it's really about assuring that the military remains funded, why is it necessary to have it be a non-negotiable condition of the bill that Planned Parenthood be zeroed out and that the EPA be prevented from enforcing the Clean Air Act? I don't see that there's any connection between those two requirements and the deficit, and I think if the party, Republican Party were willing to give up those two demands, we could solve this very quickly. It's those two demands that are fouling things up and forcing a shutdown.
Well, I appreciate the senator's comment, and I'd like to respond to that. The House has sent over a bill that does not have those provisions in it, a one-week extension, and that funds the military. And it's available to be passed also, and would allow further discussions and negotiations on how to complete the last of the year without affecting the military. And I just have to tell you, I have no desire to fund Planned Parenthood, the largest abortion provider in America. Maybe that's what you think federal taxpayers ought to spend their money on, but I don't. But that's not the critical issue. The critical issue is how much we spend. I certainly agree with that. And the House has sent over legislation both for the whole year, fiscal year, and for a short term to continue it. And if this government is shut down, it'll be because the Democratic Senate and the threat of President Obama to veto this legislation if it were passed. Why don't they bring it up for a vote? Perhaps it's because a number of Democrats who are uneasy about this reckless spending might feel that a voting for this would be a good way to continue the negotiations and work through it. And it might pass. So the President now has jumped into the middle of it and proposed to shut the government down. And I don't appreciate my colleague so fine. We serve on the Judiciary Committee together, talking about this is all extremist right-wingers. Give me a break. He said they really have this secret agenda. They pretend it's all about the deficits. It's not about the deficits. It's about some extremist right-wing agenda that it then launches into a full-fledged attack, as has Senator Schumer, on the Tea Party. Some of the best people in our country who got terribly afraid for our nation and went out and marched all over America, millions, tens of millions. Never before done anything like that. I talk to them all the time. Are these bad people? And let me tell you, Erskine Bowles, former chief of staff to President Clinton, chosen by President Obama to head his debt commission, came before the Budget Committee just 2 weeks ago, and he and Alan Simpson, his co-chairman, issued a written statement. We are facing the most predictable economic crisis in our nation's history. Predictable crisis means we could be thrown back into another recession or a depression. When asked by Chairman Conrad, our Democratic chairman, when this might happen, what did President Obama's chairman say? 2 years, maybe a little before, maybe a little later. Alan Simpson piped up, I think 1 year. Hopefully this isn't so. Hopefully we're not going to have a debt crisis in a year or 2 years. But these people who took testimony for weeks and months and provided their opinion on how to fix our debt say we're facing a debt crisis that could put us into a recession and surge unemployment even though it's just beginning to come down a little bit. This is not a Republican-Democratic squabble. These are Democrats, leaders that warned us. Alice Rivlin headed the other commission with Pete Domenici, our former chairman of the Budget Committee. Pete Domenici, now retired from the Senate, said, I've never been more afraid for my country. One of the most eloquent orators I've ever heard in the Senate. Never been more afraid for my country. When you have deficits, that this year we take in $3.8 trillion and, we take in $2.2 trillion and spend $3.7 trillion. Borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend, we are creating a nation at risk. That's what we're talking about. So this past election, it was a big issue. All over America, candidates ran for office. And the ones who are the big spenders, who are in denial about the danger the nation faces, got shellacked. 64 Republicans got elected to the House, the biggest Republican victory in 80 years over one issue, spending, really. I mean, that's what it was. And so when we come into the Senate, and they had only passed, when they had this supermajority in the House and the Senate, and they passed a, 5-month continuing resolution. The Democrats didn't pass a budget, nor did they pass a single appropriations bill. Everybody knew that after this election, that the funding level was going to be reduced. The American people had spoken. So we walks in, and our majority leader, Harry Reid, said, well, we'll cut spending $4.6 billion out of $3,700 billion that we spend. Give me a break. $4.6 billion out of $3,700 billion that we spend, this is somehow significant? The House only recommended $61 billion in the last 7 months, but that makes a difference. $61 billion, when you reduce the baseline, $61 billion, and the interest you save every year, $61 billion plus interest, it adds up to $860 billion saved over a 10-year period. That's all coming close to $1 trillion saved, just by that one act. But when you spend on the upswing, likewise, you end up raising the baseline and surging spending and debt. That's why we've got to get responsible, and when we do, we can make a bigger impact than a lot of people think. But I remain really unhappy and stunned that my Democratic colleagues are in full-fledged attack on the good and decent people who stood up and complained about what was happening in Washington and now don't hesitate to attack the Tea Party as extremists. I object to that. I think it's wrong. So we are in a serious problem. I think many of my colleagues, I know many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have expressed to me that we need to do better, that we've got to change the trajectory we're on. I think there's a real possibility for bipartisan action, but it's only a possibility. I actually have been fairly hopeful, and we've had a lot of talk on the other side of the aisle, but I haven't seen anything move in the Senate. Nothing except the President's budget, which Senator from Wyoming said Economist magazine called it dishonest. It is. And what they said about it was been found false by 5 different fact checks. They say it calls on us to live within our means. The budget director said it will allow us to pay down our debt. When the lowest single deficit that we are projected to have under the budget the President submitted to us is $740 billion.
Senator's time has expired.
I thank the Chair and would yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. We are on the verge, unfortunately, of a possible government shutdown, which is extraordinarily regrettable. Controlling the deficit and paying down the deficit is a critical priority for this country. It must be done. It is a difficult challenge, but not insurmountable. We've done it before in the 1990s. I was a member of the House of Representatives when President Clinton was able to push through an economic program that did not focus exclusively and entirely, as the Republican proposal did, on simply discretionary spending, domestic discretionary spending. It looked across the board at spending, not only domestic spending, but defense spending. It looked on the revenue side. It also looked at some of our entitlement programs. The result was, from the 1993-1994 action of a Democratic Congress, by 2000, when President Bush was sworn in with a Republican Congress, there was a projected multi-trillion-dollar surplus. We were looking at robust employment. And so it is indeed, I think, sometimes difficult to listen to some of my colleagues talk about the deficit and President Obama when recognizing under their leadership, President Bush and a Republican Congress, a surplus was turned into a huge deficit. In fact, President Bush doubled the national debt in 8 years. It had taken more than 200 years to accumulate a debt. He doubled it. So we're here and prepared to make those reasonable and responsible decisions that will lead us forward to a hopefully balanced budget and hopefully what we accomplished under Democratic leadership, President Clinton, in the 90s, hopefully even some surpluses going forward. But it won't take and can't be done in 2 weeks. We can't undo what has taken place since 2000 in 2 weeks or 2 months. It's going to take concerted, collaborative effort. And one of the problems we've had, frankly, is that the goalposts have been continuously shifting in terms of Republican proposals. The Republicans' Appropriation Committee initially insisted on levels last year, roughly a $20 billion cut, in my recollection. Then this year, the House Appropriations Committee, under Republican leadership, proposed initially cuts of $33 billion from the fiscal year 2010 level. Days later, the Republican leadership decided that was not enough, so then it became $60 billion, with cuts in everything from EPA water and sewer grants to low-income energy assistance programs that are absolutely critical to working families. And also critical at a time when our economy is just beginning to regain some of the economic traction it had before. We're seeing some encouraging employment numbers. We're seeing some increase in consumer demand. This approach, this draconian approach to cuts, could very seriously undermine the emerging, not yet complete, but emerging recovery. And in addition to the the numbers that keep moving around, the proposal of the Republican House is studded with special interest riders, social policy, not fiscal policy. And in fact, there is the impression sometimes that the deficit reduction claims are really just an excuse to try to advance, not through the legislative process, but through the appropriation process, through the threat of a shutdown, very conservative social policies. These policies should be debated, they should be voted upon, but to try to present them as non-negotiable demands with the penalty for failure to heed to their demands, the shutdown of the entire U.S. government is, I think, inappropriate. The President and Leader Reid have been meeting continuously. There was a sense that a proposal of about $33 billion of cuts from the appropriate baseline would be appropriate, but then that seems to keep moving again. And this is unlike 1995 when we saw the last shutdown of this government by a Republican Congress. Again, this is becoming almost ritualistic. A Republican House is elected, and then within months there's a shutdown of the government. That shutdown lasted about 26 days, cost about $1.4 billion in essentially deadweight loss to the economy and to the government. We're on the verge of repeating that, I think, mistake. But back in 1994, we weren't engaged in two conflicts with American servicemen and women engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were not participating in a very volatile NATO operation involving Libya. We had yet to see the threat of international terrorism unleashed so dramatically on our shores as it was on 9/11. And again, if this government is shut down, there are thousands of civilians and civilian contractors who are part of our intelligence services that are at least in limbo as to whether they can continue to provide us the information and the insights we need to protect ourselves against a still existing and now clearly obvious threat. These are much more challenging times. Indeed, for months now, in terms of a response to why the economy isn't growing, and many of my colleagues on this side say, well, it's just the uncertainty of the Obama policies. And that was the argument last year for the extension of the income tax cuts, not only to middle-income Americans, but to the wealthiest Americans. That uncertainty would breed a lack of investment, a lack of focus on job recovery. What could be more uncertain than shutting down the government of the United States without any plan to bring it back, and indeed without any clue as to what is the critical issue that must be addressed? At one point it's deficit, at another point it's social policy. That uncertainty, I think, could lead, I hope it does not, to a lack of confidence in our capacity to govern, which will ripple through economic markets worldwide, which could, and which also, I think, could challenge the perception of the United States as a coherent world leader. Well, there are some things that would be, unfortunately, resulting from such a shutdown. We know military and federal pay will be delayed. In fact, uniformed military will be required to come to work, as they do, so it's dedicated to the service of this nation, but their pay will cease the moment we shut this government down. Literally, there will be soldiers on the ground and sailors, Marines, airmen in Afghanistan and Iraq who will be fighting and not being paid, and their families at home will not receive those benefits. The Federal Housing Administration won't be able to endorse any single-family mortgage loans. So if you're ready to close on your loan next week, you have the down payment, you're ready to go, can't be done because the FHA is out of business. SBA guaranteed loans for businesses, working capital, for real estate investment, for those things that are trying to move the economy, stopped dead in their tracks. So you're a small business man or woman, you're ready to expand your company, you're ready to hire more people, sorry, SBA closed until further notice. IRS cannot process tax refunds for those who are filing their returns and are depending upon their tax refund, as so many working families do, just to get through the next several months. We didn't get here overnight. In 1993, Democrats saw these same problems, a deficit that was prolonged and gnawing at the economic fabric of this country. We took deliberate action. It took several years, but within those several years, we saw, by the end of President Clinton's administration, a surplus, a robust employment situation, and the future looked very, very good to working families. 2001, as I indicated, President Bush came into office with a surplus, but after tax cuts that were unpaid for, 2 costly wars that were unpaid for, an unpaid for extension of our entitlement program in terms of Part D Medicare, the largest, by the way, expansion of government entitlements in many, many decades. We are now looking at a huge deficit. Now, President Obama came into office at a time when unemployment was, in my state, reaching beyond 12, almost to 14%. He was, I think, required to take appropriate action. With the Recovery Act, we were able to begin to restore some of the jobs. We've seen over the last year growth in civilian jobs, the private sector workforce, that we didn't see under President Bush. In fact, the recent report suggests over 200,000 jobs. Those are the kind of numbers that have to be sustained, not undercut. And you don't sustain them by shutting down the government and shutting down programs like SBA, like the Federal Housing Administration. We are and have to work diligently. And I think, and I hear my colleagues talking about reaching out, collaborating, and I hope that's the spirit we embraced in the last several hours. But we've heard many other statements coming, particularly from across the Capitol in the other chamber, about how we've got to shut this government down, how we have to go ahead and make a point, not make sound policy. That is not going to lead us to a better future for American families. And so, Mr. President, you know, I believe we have to be responsible. We have to recognize that the problems before us will take months, if not years, to fully resolve because they took years, not days or weeks, to accumulate. We have to be responsible to troops in the field, not only to order them into battle, but to support their families at home. We have to be responsible to families all across this country to give them a chance to use their talents to contribute.
Senator's time has expired.
And I would urge responsibility at this moment, not the shutdown of the U.S. government.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
I would ask unanimous consent that the 10 minutes, I believe, that's allotted on this side, that I be allowed to have 3, and Senator Moran 7 of that 10.
Without objection.
Mr. President, on the question of funding the Defense Department, it's a very serious matter. We do need to handle that correctly. I would just recall for my colleagues that the House has sent legislation to us that would fund the government for an additional week with the reduction in spending of $12 billion, but that would fund the Defense Department for the rest of the fiscal year and take that matter off the table, guarantee there will be no disruption of the Defense Department. We really should do that. We should have already done that. Senator McConnell, our leader on the Republican side, has said he won't support any of these, any more CR unless we do fund the Defense Department. I would have to suggest, however, that it appears to me that our colleagues are using the Defense Department as hostage to and as leverage the threat of shutting down or partially shutting down the Defense Department. The threat of that is used to sort of say that we're not going to cut spending anymore. So that's the fight we're on, and you've heard the discussion about riders, but the new CR the House sent to us today doesn't have those riders on it, and it's not a problem in that regard. So I just want to say that I do think it's irresponsible for the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, to threaten to shut down the government. The House, the Republican House, has sent a bill over that funds the government and funds the Department. The threat to shut down the government is coming from the defense side, and I don't think the people are going to be fooled by this, and I do believe that American people's voices will be heard, and the amount of reduction in spending is not, it makes a difference in how much is saved over a decade, but the Nobel Prize laureate Gary Becker, the superb economist John Taylor, former Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of State George Shultz did a Wall Street Journal article recently noting that under our spending, the spending now is 24.1% of GDP. If the House bill that cuts spending by $61 billion were passed, we would be spending 20.0%, 1/10 of 1% reduction in spending from that calculation. I thank the Chair and would yield the floor to my colleague, and I'm delighted to have him in the Senate.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I thank the gentleman for yielding and come here tonight one more time. I'm a very short-term member of the United States Senate, only about 3 months, but every time I have spoken on the Senate floor, I've talked about the importance of reining in spending, the crippling nature of our national debt, and the belief that if we don't resolve these issues, that the future of our country is at stake. And it's really one of the primary motivations I have for serving in this Congress is to see that we turn this country around for the benefit of our children and grandchildren. And I think Kansans would say that it's time for all members of Congress to come together and to fund the government. A shutdown demonstrates once again how we lack the ability or the desire to just use some common sense and to reach a common goal. A primary function of a Congress is to see that we appropriate the necessary funds to provide for government. And today it seems to me that we have come to the point in which this issue needs to be rapidly resolved. We are down to just a few $1 billion, and certainly $1 billion is a lot of money, and it's a lot of money to Kansans, it's a lot of money to me. But we need to resolve this issue so that we can move on to the more dramatic and important issue that we face as members of the Senate, as we face as American citizens, that being next year's budget and the future of additional spending down the road. But tonight, in addition to saying let's resolve this issue, let's continue to fund the government, let's not pursue the strategy of a shutdown, I am here to express my genuine concern about the tactics that seem to be ongoing today in which we, as the senator from Alabama suggests, are holding hostage our servicemen and women and their pay. We've had a lot of discussion here in Washington, D.C. about who's an essential government employee. I would tell you there can be no question but what our servicemen and women are essential government employees, and they will be working regardless of the consequences, regardless of the decisions that are made here about the so-called shutdown. And from my view, it makes absolutely no sense. In fact, it is immoral to ask our servicemen and women to serve in harm's way and have to worry about whether or not the paycheck that feeds their families. And many of our servicemen, in fact, most of our servicemen and women live month to month, live paycheck to paycheck. And the idea that while they're serving and sacrificing away from family, that they would have the additional concern about whether or not the paycheck is going to arrive and be deposited in their account seems to me to be something beyond the pale, something that we could never expect from a Congress of the United States of America. And so I'm here one more time to say, yes, absolutely, let's get spending under control. The idea that we cannot go back to 2008 spending levels plus inflation, we can do that. No one should believe that we cannot accomplish that goal, and no one should be using the servicemen and women, their paycheck, their service to our country as hostage for the idea of whether or not this government is shut down. Resolve this issue now, and make certain we resolve it in a way that no member of our armed services or their family is harmed by the decisions that we make. This is an important decision. It's about the future of our country, but the immediate concern is whether or not our servicemen and women understand that we value their service, and we will take every step to make certain that they are not harmed by the political inaction, the inability of us in Washington, D.C. to resolve the issue of the continuing resolution. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I rise to share my deep concern that we are careening towards a shutdown of the U.S. government. Just a little more than 24 hours from now, tomorrow night, our government will shut down if this chamber and the House chamber cannot come together and put a simple continuing resolution on the President's desk. You know, there are a lot of things that we should be and should be proud of. One is to be a nation that has been a light for the world, presenting the ideals of democracy in action and advocating for and defending human rights. We should be deeply pleased that we have fought for fair working conditions and economic opportunity for Americans across this great land. We should be proud of a tradition of public education that gives children an opportunity to fulfill their full potential. We should be deeply pleased of our history advocating for freedom of speech and freedom of association and freedom of liberty. All of these things are part of a legacy for our nation, a part of what this chamber has been about. But we should not be pleased, and we should not accept that this chamber is now engaged not in those great and lofty ideals, but in a very small argument over an extension of the budget for 6 months, and that we are so dysfunctional that we are risking shutting the American government down for one of the few times in its history. That is not the model we wish to show to the world. Now, I'll tell you, I am deeply, deeply frustrated by what has transpired since the year 2000. The first 11 years of this century, indeed the first 11 years of this millennium, have not been kind ones for the United States of America. In the year 2000, we were running huge surpluses. I was back in Oregon, part of the legislature, and very excited by the fact that we were paying down our national debt, and that economists were starting to debate, well, should we pay it down in 3 years or 5 years? Do we need to keep a substantial debt for some strange economic reason, or should we pay the whole thing off? And I'm thinking, isn't that a great debate to have? Because we're going to hand a debt-free nation to our children. Yes, Mr. Leader.
Could I ask my friend to withhold for a...
I yield to our esteemed leader.
I appreciate that.
Your leader.
I'm headed to the White House. There will be no more votes tonight. We hope that we're able to have some good fortune at the White House, work our way through these issues. But as I indicated outside the door here, I'm not as confident as I was. The last 24 hours have not been kind to the American people. This is not a debate, Mr. President, between Democrats and Republicans. It's a debate between Republicans and Republicans. They cannot determine how many social issues that they want. The funding is pretty well taken care of, but that's not where we are. We're here trying to fund the government to the end of this fiscal year. based not on money, but on social issues, some of which has been in this country for 40 years. We haven't settled the issues in 40 years. We're not going to settle them in a few hours. So I'm not really optimistic. I hope things are better when I get to the White House. We can work something out. But it's really, really too bad for the American people what's going on. I would ask consent that my friend, the distinguished senator from Oregon's statement not appear interrupted in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader.
Senator from Oregon.
And I think we all share the thought that there be good karma tonight in the discussions and that we not shut this government down. That's what certainly this debate is about on this floor right now. And it goes back to this point in 2000 when we had a new president come in who decided that paying off the debt wasn't that important. No, President Bush said bonus breaks, big giveaways, the wealthiest Americans, that's important, and did so without paying for them in any other manner. And then we had a war launched in Afghanistan. Instead of a president coming forward and saying, we, the American people, must sacrifice, we must pay for this war, it's that important to our national security, instead we had a president who came forward and said, American citizens, please keep spending a lot of money in the retail stores. That's the way you can participate in this. And so debt was greatly increased to pay for that war. And then we had a president launch a war in Iraq. And by the way, it's the same president, President Bush, proceeded to give away the treasury to the wealthiest Americans. President Bush decided not to pay for a war in Afghanistan. President Bush decided to launch a war in Iraq on completely false premises, and to do so not paying for it. And then we have Medicare Part D. That happened in that same 8-year period, a huge additional expansion of a government program, a program that will indeed, has helped many Americans, will help many Americans, but was not paid for. And those decisions, those 4 decisions, doubled the debt from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. But doubling was not enough. Indeed, the Bush administration did something else, and that is they created a house of cards out of the most important financial document for every American family, and that's the home mortgage. By deregulating retail mortgages, they allowed liar loans, those undocumented loans. They allowed teaser rates, those 2-year really low rates that mortgage agents use to talk people into subprime loans when they qualified for prime loans. They allowed steering payments, those undisclosed payments to the mortgage originators that rewarded them for steering families from prime loans into subprime loans. And then they took all of those faulty subprime mortgages and packaged them into securities and allowed a new unregulated form of insurance to back up those securities. Those were called swaps or derivatives. And a $50 trillion unregulated industry came upon the American scene. And those securities ended up in every financial institution around this nation. And this great house of cards, which corrupted the fundamental value of primary wealth for most Americans, the humble, fully amortizing prime loan mortgage, was turned into an instrument of mass financial destruction. And that financial destruction that was brought down on our house in 2008, 2009 added another $4 trillion to the debt. So we went from $5 trillion to $14 trillion. And that process continued just this last December with a compromise that added another $500 billion to the debt, a compromise I could not support because it added $500 billion additional to the debt. Well, I had a lot of hope just January, 3 months ago, that we had a new group come in, and we had a new Congress, the 112th Congress, and now we were going to be able to proceed to create jobs and to do so by ending some of those really frivolous giveaways, those massive oil and gas giveaways that line the bottom line of some of the deepest pockets in our nation, those rules that prevent us from negotiating over drug prices, which result in our seniors in Medicare paying higher prices for drugs than any other seniors anywhere in the world, even though those drugs were invented right here. Potential savings of $6 billion per year. Those bonus breaks for billionaires on top of $100,000 per taxpayer, up to $1 million more for many taxpayers. Those bonus breaks, taking them away, savings of $50 billion a year. Ending duplicative Pentagon programs identified by the Secretary of Defense, savings of $75 billion. All of these opportunities and so many more to bring our financial house into order. But those hopes were soon dashed because a new team in the other house of the U.S. Congress didn't decide to fight for jobs, didn't decide to fight to get rid of frivolous programs. Instead, they decided to lay out a plan that attacks the very communities that have been most hurt by the previous disasters. Because that meltdown, that mortgage meltdown that's haunted us in 2008, 2009, it destroyed the wealth of basic Americans through their homes. Homes have lost enormous value. It proceeded to destroy jobs that those families counted on, huge job losses. It proceeded to wipe out their retirement savings. And no wonder that so many families today don't have confidence that their lives, the lives of their children, will be better than their lives. And so for so many families, in fact, their current life is not better than their parents' life was because of these kinds of devastating decisions. But the new arrival said, no, we're going to increase the harm. We're going to attack the community development grants that build community organizations. We're going to attack the heating programs that keep people from freezing. We're going to diminish the food programs that keep people from starving. We're going to attack women's health programs, programs that have nothing to do, by the way, with abortion. But preventative programs, screenings, Pap screenings, breast exams, we're going to attack and wipe those out because of misguided ideological opinions. And now we find a bill that says it's going to dismantle Medicare. We find an attack on housing for veterans. These are not the things that will bring jobs to America. These are not the things that will rebuild America. Now, on top of all of these attacks on specific programs, my colleagues in the House decided to create a whole long list of ideological writers to add to the budget debate. So I have a copy here, 4 pages, policy writers in House Resolution 1. It goes on and on and on everything you can imagine, from Job Corps centers to training for our unemployed Americans. It's a huge list. It defunds the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that will guard against the sort of corruption of mortgages that I was discussing earlier. It attacks the EPA's ability to enforce the Clean Air Act, and so on and so forth. An unbelievable list that every American should see to see what the true agenda is on the other side of Capitol Hill. Now is the time to set aside these games, these ideological writers. Now is the time to set aside these attacks on the core programs that strengthen our communities. We are past the time to have the ability to just do a simple 6-month extension of our programs here in the United States of America so we can go on to debate FY fiscal year 2012. But not everybody is ready for that serious debate. We've been hearing a lot of chanting at rallies that folks, they do want to shut down the government over these ideological writers. Indeed, April 5th, the Washington Post reported Republicans gave the Speaker, that's over on the House side, an ovation when he informed them to begin preparing for a possible shutdown. They want the shutdown because they want this ideological fight. So after having proceeded through devastating mistake after devastating mistake that increased our national debt from $5 trillion in the year 2000, and remember it was headed down towards zero, to nearly $15 trillion, we still can't have a serious conversation. We have folks who want to shut down this government over these ideological writers. So I must say, we must return to understanding our role here in the Senate and in the House in terms of the broad and challenging and important issues facing America. The issue of providing fundamental services, the issue of creating jobs, and the lofty goals of advancing democracy and human rights and civil rights around this planet. Now is the time to set aside those shallow ideological games, focus on rebuilding our economy and putting America back on track. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from New York.
Are we in a quorum call, Mr. President?
No, we are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise. First, I want to salute my colleague from Oregon for his eloquent words and his passion. I know he has dedicated his life to making the lives of people better, and that's why he feels so strongly about how badly a government shutdown would affect average folks. Now, I agree with him. Simply put, Mr. President, there is no reason for a government shutdown. Absolutely no reason at all. A genuine bipartisan compromise with significant and responsible cuts in government spending is in hand, but it's being vetoed by an extreme minority of the Republican Party. The tail is wagging the dog. The most extreme, the people least likely to compromise, the people in general with less experience in government, and at least from their statements, little respect for views not their own, are dominating the House of Representatives. Speaker Boehner is somebody we all have a great deal of affection for and sympathy for. But you know, Mr. President, the hour is nigh, and leadership is called for. And to allow this small group, relatively small group, when you look at the expanse of our government, to dominate everything that is happening and hurt millions of innocent people is not leadership. When the Speaker says there is no agreement on the numbers or the cuts, he just means he isn't ready to say so publicly. It is true I have not been inside the negotiating room, but I have heard all the details from my friend and colleague and leader, Harry Reid. I have heard the details from those who have been negotiating. And the bottom line is the number and what composes that number of cuts is virtually agreed to. The only reason there is not a handshake is Speaker Boehner and his representatives don't want it to appear that the numbers are signed off on for two reasons, in my opinion. One, they're afraid what these hard right colleagues would say. And number two, then it will focus everything on their true casus belli, which is the riders. So, Mr. President, this is no longer about spending. The hard right in the House of Representatives wants to make this about ideology, injecting last-minute ideological add-ons like limiting preventive health for women. Mr. President, we have a fiscal crisis in this country, not a social crisis. And let's not gloss over what's going on here. Republicans really don't care about reducing the deficit. Otherwise, they wouldn't have paraded out a budget this week that ends Medicare for our seniors, but protects trillions in tax breaks for corporations and millionaires. If you care about deficit reduction, yes, you would want to cut Medicare. But you'd also want to make sure millionaires pay their fair share of taxes, because every dollar from the millionaires goes just as much to reducing the deficit as a dollar for Medicare cuts. So when you do one and not the other, you don't care about deficit reduction. You may care about shrinking the government. You may wish there were no government at all. That's a perspective of some. But you don't care about deficit reduction. And one of the things that has not been made apparent is cutting government programs to many on the other side of the aisle is not in sync with reducing the deficit. And those two are too often confused. So why are we here? Why are we on the eve of a shutdown of government which will hurt millions? It's because this hard right in the House of Representatives, some of the members of the Tea Party, others of them allies of the Tea Party, want to satisfy the agenda of the extreme right wing. And if they don't get everything they want, Mr. President, they have made their desire clear. And we don't have to make this up, Mr. President. They say it. Here's Mike Pence, one of the leading Republicans in the House of Representatives, one of the leaders of the Tea Party caucus. What does he say? Shut it down. That's what he wants. Either he thinks he's going to get his way by shutting it down. You know, I grew up on streets in Brooklyn, and there were people who thought that just by bullying they could get their way. Shut it down if you don't do it all my way. Well, bullying doesn't work, and we will not be bullied. We will not hurt millions of people. We will not abandon our principles because the other side believes that we will do whatever they want, falsely believes that we will do whatever they want because otherwise they will shut the government down. We don't want to shut the government down. I have not heard a single Democrat say what Mike Pence has said. But I've heard lots of Republicans. I've heard Sarah Palin talk about the shutdown being a good thing. I've heard Newt Gingrich talk about the shutdown being a good thing. I've heard some of Mr. Pence's colleagues, probably a dozen or so, in the House of Representatives saying shut it down is a good thing. Have you heard a single Democratic elected official say it? No. That alone should tell you who wants to shut the government down or who is willing to shut the government down and who is fighting strongly against it. They want to shut the government down if they don't get their way. As I said, I've seen people do things like that growing up on the streets of Brooklyn. And you know what you learn? If you keep giving in and giving in and giving in, they ask for more and more and more. And the way to deal with someone who is attempting to bully you is to stand up to them. We have gone so far in their direction. President Obama said to Speaker Boehner, it's reported, you've gotten 3/4 of what you want. Why don't you declare victory and go home? Well, we know why Speaker Boehner can't do that, Mr. President. It's very simple. Because then there would be a rebellion among a key part of his constituency. The hard right, many of them, but not all of them freshmen, in the House of Representatives. Most of them have very little experience in government. I dare say most of them don't know the consequences of a government shutdown or of the kinds of cuts they're suggesting. But they come in with an ideological narrowness. And, Mr. President, when either party lets the extremes dominate, they lose. When Republicans let the hard right dominate, they lose. And frankly, we've learned our lesson as Democrats. When we let the hard left dominate, we will lose too. Because most Americans are somewhere in the middle. And so, Mr. President, this idea of shutting the government down or of applauding a standing ovation when the Speaker informs them to begin preparing to shut the government down, I guarantee you will backfire on its perpetrators, just as it did on Newt Gingrich in 1995. But that is political consolation, small consolation for the damage that will be done to individual people who will lose jobs, to the economy. Just one fact. HA will not be able to issue any guarantees on guarantees 80% of our mortgages, including mortgages for the middle class, the bulk of mortgages. Middle-class people will not be able to take out mortgages. What does that do to our economy in the housing sector? The Social Security Administration will not be able to mail out a good percentage of refunds. What does that do to the economy? When the money is stuck in Washington instead of going back to people who rightfully own it, and they will spend it in the stores, in the shops, and on vacation. And there's other irresponsibilities. We have American troops fighting abroad. We want to make sure that they are fully funded. A government shutdown will not do that. Colleagues on the other side are coming up with a unbalanced, short-term extension that funds the troops. Well, I say to my colleagues, you want to fund the troops, not for 1 week. Don't shut the government down. That's the best way to support our troops. So it's time for Republicans to be responsible It's time for the majority of Republicans, who I don't agree with on many issues, but I know who are mainstream and really don't like this government shutdown, to stand up to those on the hard right, to accept the compromise we're so close to working out, and drop the ideological riders so that we can move forward. Mr. President, we are at a crucial time in this country. We've had a rough few years. We're beginning slowly to climb our way out of it. This is risky. A government shutdown is risky. And, Mr. President, the shame of it all is it is so easily avoided. All we need, again, is a little bit of strength and courage from the Speaker to tell the hard right in his party that, yes, he will try to accommodate some of their needs, but he will not shut the government down. To tell them that, yes, we do have to cut government spending, and we Democrats, the vast majority of us, agree with that. We don't believe in cutting things like cancer research or loans that go to students who are going to college. But there's a lot of waste in the government. There's a lot of excess. We can wring that out without hurting people and reduce our deficit. We agree. And the proposals we have made, including $73 billion below the President's proposal for this year, shows that we put our money where our mouth is. But every time we come close to an agreement, Speaker Boehner, not on his own in my judgment, but pulled by the Tea Party, pulls the goalposts back. He pulls them back on the numbers, although we've gone so far that it's hard for him to do that any longer. But he also does it with these ideological riders. And so, Mr. President, we are at a sad moment. We are at a time when the continuation of this government and the hardworking people who compose it is right on the edge of closing, with untold damage to innocent people. I would ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and in the other house, I would plead with them. Let's stop the political games. Let's stop the ideological posturing. Let's stop thinking it has to be only my way and no one else's. Let's come meet in the middle with a reasonable agreement, keep the government going, and move forward to do the things the American people have asked us to do. I yield the floor. I know, Mr. President.
Senator from New York.